I'd like to welcome everyone here this afternoon. My name is Dr. Philip Phillips, and I'm the Associate Dean of the University Honors College here at Middle Tennessee State University. I'm welcoming you again to our Fall Honors Lecture Series on veterans. It's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Dr. David Foote. A native of Rochester, New York, Dr. David Foote earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in Religion and Philosophy from Roberts Wesleyan College in 1975 before entering the U.S. Navy. He served on 7 different ships before assuming command of the Naval Reserve Center in Lexington, Kentucky, where he earned his MBA at the University of Kentucky. He retired from the Navy in 1995 and returned to the University of Kentucky in 1996 to begin work on his PhD, earning his doctorate in 1999 in the field of management with a specialty in organizational behavior. A member of our honors faculty and past chair of the Honors Council, Dr. Foote is Associate Dean and Professor of Management in the Jones College of Business, as well as the founding director of the Institute of Leadership Excellence, the ILE, here at MTSU. Dean Foote has received the Top 30 Award for Teaching Excellence in the Jones College of Business every year since its inception in 2003, was named Outstanding Faculty Member in the College of Business in 2005, and received the State Farm Award for Professional Promise in 2009. Please join me in welcoming Dean Foote, who will talk to us today on Veterans in Higher Ed, Competing Effects of Military Training.
Don't you love that beard? Man, I have beard envy. Were I to grow a beard, I'm afraid it would be thinner than what's on the top of my head. What little is left on the top of my head now. So, I love that beard. Philip told you a minute ago that I spent some time in the Navy. The first ship I was on was an aircraft carrier on the West Coast. And when we had the air wing on board, there were roughly a little over 5,000 people on the ship, which meant that no matter what you were doing, you had to stand in line to do it. And I mean everything, including going to the bathroom. You had to stand in line, didn't matter what time of the day it was. And the ship ran 2 full food lines 4 times a day to feed those 5,000 people. And we also had a fast food, if you want to call it that, line where you could just go and get a hamburger or a hot dog that ran 23 hours a day. And so oftentimes I would go down, because I was up for one reason or another in the middle of the night, I'd go down to the fast food lane at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning and only have to stand in line there for 30 to 45 minutes to get my hamburger or hot dog. Which makes me think of a story about an Army situation where the drill sergeant had just finished chewing out one of his cadets and turned to walk away and then looked over his shoulder and said, "I'll bet when I die, you're going to come and dance on my grave." And the cadet said, "No, sir, not me. I promised myself when I get out of the Army, I'm never going to stand in another line." So veterans in higher ed. How many of you are veterans? 2? 3? 4? Anybody Navy? No. Okay, so well, that's good. My Navy stories will be interesting to you. Guess you won't have lived them. Competing Effects of Military Training, and I put a subtitle on it, Soldier to Student Transition, Variations on a Theme. And I'm going to say right up front, when I say soldier, I'm also talking about sailors and airmen and all the rest, okay? So we're talking about all veterans when we use the term soldier. We're only going to touch on a few of the things that enter into this whole equation of soldier to student transition today. But this was kind of my starting point. That when I look back over my years teaching here at MTSU, my sense was that the veterans I had encountered, for the most part, either were able to carry over their military discipline into higher ed and do well, or they were lost without it and floundered, actually rather badly, appearing to lack the self-discipline and or the ability to make sense of their newly adopted roles. And so I started to wonder, what is it that causes that? Why do some veterans do really well and other veterans do rather poorly? And that was sort of the impetus for this whole topic today. The first thing that I found was something called transition theory. It was developed by Nancy Schlossberg. And transition theory suggests that the success of any major life transition consists of 4 primary elements. The first one is the situation, or the framework within which the transition occurs. And that is one of the 4 things that I'm just going to call her Nancy, okay? Nancy said affect transition. And within that, what's the trigger? What was the impetus for the transition? Why are you making this transition? Was it forced on you, or are you doing it voluntarily? Are you coming back? Are you coming to higher education because it's something you really want to do, or is it, in a broader sense, any transition that you go through, is it something that's imposed on you? What's the role change that's involved? What was your role before? What's it going to be in the future? And how does that affect the transition? Is the old role similar to the new role, or are they very different? Okay. What experiences do you bring to the situation? What else is going on at the same time? You've probably all seen the lists of things that are major life stresses, stress causers, getting married, getting divorced 2 weeks later, having children in between, buying a house, selling a house, moving, changing jobs, losing a loved one. And it's a long, long list of things that cause a lot of stress in people's lives. So how many of those other things are going on while you're making this transition? And that's a significant factor as well. In particular, a lot of times when people are coming out of the military, they've either recently gotten married, or they're getting married, or they're back home now, so babies are a possibility, that kind of thing. When you're in the military, a lot of times you're in housing, or if you've left a family member behind, that person is living with relatives or whatever, and so when you get back home, it's time to buy a house or start working on that and so forth. So a lot of things going on. The second part of this, according to Nancy, is yourself. Who are you? And there are demographic factors. Research suggests that men transition differently from women generally. Older people transition differently from younger people. Your health status affects your ability to make the transition successfully. Your ego, and we're talking here about appropriate ego, not an overinflated one or an underinflated one, a deflated one. People who have a healthy, appropriate ego tend to transition better, more successfully than do people who don't have an appropriate ego. Your personality, how you look at the world, the values that you hold, which means the things that you think are important in whatever situation you're in, those all affect your transition as well. The third part of this is your support system. To what extent do you have support structures in place? Your family, your friends, maybe fraternity or sorority if you're in higher education, Other formal means of support that you might have in place, that can make a huge difference in your transition. And there also is the aspect of options, support options. How many options do you have? Is there the potential there for you to develop more support systems? Some of them might be real, some of them might be things that you simply perceive to be options, but even though they're only perceived at this point, the fact that you may be able to take advantage of those support systems at some point in the future lends to your ability to make a transition successfully. And finally, the strategies that you have, the mechanisms that are available to you internally or perhaps externally to help you make the transition and deal with the stress that's involved play an important role in how successful you are in making that transition. So keeping Nancy's theory in mind, transition theory, there are several things that we're going to talk a little bit more about. Some of the factors that have particular salience for veterans when they're transitioning from military or more specifically combat to a higher education setting. And the first one is culture. And we're going to start by talking about military culture because that's where we're coming from. Military is a fortress or warrior society. It's a society that conditions its citizens for constant vigilance. Nowhere is this more true than in combat or potential combat environments. The vast majority of veterans these days have made at least one, and many of them multiple deployments to combat environments, or been deployed at sea for an extended period of time, once or more. I made 4 6-month trips to the Mediterranean Sea during my time in the Navy and multiple trips to the Caribbean Sea for other things. And no, we didn't spend a lot of time in the Bahamas, at least not at the casino or anyplace else ashore. Speaking of that, though, when you think about people in combat environments, we think about bullets whizzing by and the possibility of being killed being imminent, the danger of roadside bombs and so forth. We hear a lot about that now. But I want to, perhaps because I come from that background, reinforce the idea that Navy ships are not a particularly safe. Let me rephrase that. They are safe, but there is potential for injury, serious injury, and death all the time because of the things that we do at sea and the equipment we operate and the environment in which we operate it. And so just, if I may digress for a minute or two here, some examples of that. There is, many of our Navy ships today have a missile launcher on the front part of the ship, called the bow. It's right in front of the superstructure where the bridge is. I have personally been on the bridge when the missile launcher is rotating during an exercise, a live firing exercise, and the missile launcher rotates around and it gets to where it's almost pointing at the bridge, and then it keeps right on going and it's pointing right at you. And you are totally dependent on the electronic cutouts in the missile launcher system to keep that missile from firing while the thing is pointing at you. There are, let's see, engine rooms on every ship. Used to be boilers, and those are pretty dangerous in themselves because the steam is very high pressure and it can cut your arm off if you walk by a pinhole leak. But we don't have any ships with steam plants anymore. But nevertheless, they're very dangerous environments, a lot of fuel and lubricants and so forth that can catch fire. And when you're out in the middle of the ocean, you either put out the fire or you burn. Oh, you can jump overboard, but that's not much fun either. which is, by the way, why I didn't go on submarines. Can't jump overboard. Flight deck operations. People have been blown off flight decks because they were standing in the wrong place when the airplane turned around and the exhaust from the airplane blew them over the side of the ship. People have been cut in half by mooring lines that snapped. It's a very dangerous place to be. So this idea of constant vigilance is not limited to ground combat situations. Every service, every branch of service has very dangerous situations. Everything that happens in the context of a very rigid structure, including social events. And there are real and very swift punishments for violating any of those structures. Rank is important. To some people, it's everything. Wasn't to me, but to some people it is. I can clearly remember probably 1989, something like that. No, it was before that. Anyway, walking down the street, Norfolk Naval Base, with it was kind of a cool day, had a jacket on, didn't zip it up because it wasn't that cold. And here comes, I was a lieutenant at the time, in 03. Here comes a lieutenant commander the opposite way on the street. Lieutenant commander's in 04, one step up, only one rank above. And I happened to know the person and knew that he had just gotten that rank, just been promoted. Well, I'm walking up the street with my jacket unzipped, and here he comes the opposite way, crossed over the street to yell at me for not having my jacket zipped. That's actually is the proper way to wear it. It's supposed to be zipped part of the way up. Came over across the street to yell at me. I'm thinking, 2 weeks ago, you were the same rank I am. Now you're yelling at me because you're one rank higher? Some people just get really hung up on that stuff, but that's the kind of environment it is. You're told what you can do, when you can do it, how to do it, and everything about it, down to the most minute detail. And generally, you don't question it. In an environment like that, if one member of the team fails to perform his or her job properly and fully, death becomes a very real possibility. Everybody has to do it right all the time. We were in the Caribbean some years earlier in my career, doing an exercise with a battle group, doing a missile launching exercise. Remember, I was just talking about the missiles? It was supposed to be a test, and each missile launcher has a box that you can plug the cables into, and that box is designed to give the person way up in a different room who's operating equipment up there, the launching equipment, gives that person the same signals you would get from an actual missile. So one of the ships in the battle group was doing the test that day and sent a young 17-year-old fellow down there to plug the cable into the box. Unfortunately, the fellow went down and plugged the cable into the missile. But the person up in Combat Information Center operating the launching equipment up there had no way of knowing it because getting exactly the same information you would get from the test box. Went through the whole sequence, locked on the fake target, pushed the fire button, and off went the missile right through the middle of the battle group. Thankfully, it missed all of us, but then we were immediately trying to figure out where's this thing going, because that kind of missile will lock onto whatever it sees in its path after it gets out a certain way, and you don't want to be on whatever it locks onto. That was a very fortunate mistake, in a sense, because the missile just went out to its maximum distance and dropped into the water. But had there been a fishing boat out there or anything else, bad news. It's easy for those kind of mistakes to happen. Everybody's got to do it right, and everybody's got to do it right all the time. Everybody matters in that environment. Now, you switch cultures to higher education, which is an idealistic, kind of exploratory society where everybody's kind of trusts everybody else and is pretty complacent about things, in large part. Really couldn't be much different from the military culture. I kind of experienced this myself, coming out of the Navy after 20 years and coming into higher education. I couldn't tell you how many times I've sat back and thought, why is this so hard? Why does this take so long? In the Navy, you just say, do this, and 5 minutes later, it's done. And nobody asks why. You come into higher education, and particularly with faculty, and my apologies to any who are here today, but you say, well, I think we ought to do this. Well, okay, well, let's have a meeting and talk about it. And, let's make sure that we explore every angle of this thing. And maybe 2 or 3 years of talking about it, then we might decide that it's time to have a few more meetings so we can figure out how we're going to go about doing it.
Or to form a subcommittee.
Yes, or to form a subcommittee. Yes. But then we have to form another committee to figure out who's going to chair the subcommittee. It is 180 out, I'm telling you, from military to higher education. Could not be more different. And so it's a tough transition. It was a tough transition for me, and I wasn't coming in as a student. Higher education individualism is what it's all about. Questioning things, figuring out who you are. It's I mentioned earlier, it's kind of a safe place to try things without, depending on what you're trying, too many real consequences. We tell our students in business classes all the time, this is where you try something. We have case studies that we look at where students are dealing with real problems in companies. And you can make decisions about how to solve those problems without worrying about somebody losing a job or without worrying about whether the company is going to actually make a profit or not. It's a relatively safe environment. I said earlier, it's the marketplace of ideas. Questioning, asking questions, digging for answers and all that is what it's really all about in higher education. Social interaction, hey, you can be with whoever you want to be with, interact with whoever you want, whenever you want, however you want. Again, you got to stay within the laws, but basically it's pretty random, and it's up to you what you do. Veterans who have a strong ability to self-regulate tend to do very well in higher education. Self-discipline is essential in higher education. And it's not that way in the military. You got somebody telling you what to do all the time and when to do it and how to do it, and suddenly that's gone. You got to figure it out on your own, and if you're not good at self-discipline, it becomes very difficult for you. All of these cultural differences mean veterans often find themselves out of place because their new culture is so very different from the old culture. The extent to which they're able to adjust to a relaxed, carefree culture with very little structure, to engage socially with a broad range of fellow students and faculty, and the amount of self-discipline they bring to the situation all make a significant difference. Identity is another factor in transition. Your identity really has much to do with how you understand yourself in relation to your external environment. Who are you and how do you fit in? Okay? And there are, in fact, multiple identities operating at any given time. You may be a mother, a son, a friend, a student, or any one of many different roles that you play. When the social and cultural environment change, identity changes too. And when that happens, the accumulated experiences of past identity often conflict with multiple new identities. Moreover, stress involved in setting aside the old identity, well, this is who I was, but I'm not that anymore. I'm something else. What is that something else? I don't want to let go of that. I had the fellow who was my right-hand person when I was at the Reserve Center in Lexington, an E8, which is the second highest enlisted rank in the Navy, retired from the Navy about the same time I did. But he couldn't let go of it. He just could not let go of that old identity. And I don't think still has. I see stuff that he posts on Facebook every now and then. Not that I spend a lot of time on Facebook, but I see it every now and then, and he still hangs on to that old military identity, cannot let it go. What does it mean to be a student? What does it mean to be a wife? What does it mean to be a mother? Or a member or office holder in a student organization? How much time do I give to one or the other of those? How do I behave in one role or another? How does what I do in those roles determine who I am? And how does who I am determine what I do in those roles? How do I make sense or meaning out of what's going on here? My ability to do that has a lot to do with how successful I am in making this transition from soldier to student. The extent to which I have been able to make meaning or make sense of my combat experiences or my military experiences in general has an awful lot to do with my ability to make sense of my student experience. If I've been able to put my military combat experience in a positive light, I'm probably going to be better able to put my student experience in a better light. If, on the other hand, I've never been able to reconcile my military experience, chances are good that I'm going to have trouble with my student experience as well. Self-efficacy. How many of you recognize the tagline? Yeah, it's a story about the little train engine trying to get up over the hill, little engine that could. That's what self-efficacy is. If you believe you can do it, then you're going to try harder and you're going to try longer. And you're probably going to be successful, within reason. Okay? I might believe that I can fly, but I might try, might even try for a long time. But without some external apparatus, I'm probably not going to succeed at it. We're talking about realistic things. If you believe that you can be successful as a student, you're probably much more likely to be successful. Self-efficacy is to some extent socially constructed. And this is at all levels. We're talking about family, we're talking about ethnicity, we're talking about nationality. Those cultures all play into your self-efficacy. America's a can-do country, right? That affects how we think about things. If my mom and dad have told me all my young years growing up that I can do and be anything I want to be, I probably believe that too. But if growing up my mom and or dad constantly said to me, you'll probably never amount to much, there's at least a decent chance that I won't. Of course, that can go both ways. One of the ships I was on, Navy ships have an inspection every now and then called an operational propulsion plant examination. It's an inspection of the engineering side of the ship. They're huge. It's a huge inspection. If you fail it, probably the chief engineer is going to get fired and the captain's going to get a letter of reprimand and those kinds of things. Well, I was on a ship one time and we met with the captain every morning. We had to do that because he didn't think we could read our own, what we called it message traffic because it came by radio, but it was essentially what email is now. So we met with him every morning, and every morning for 6 months before our operational propulsion plant examination, he'd look at the chief engineer right in the face and point at him and say, "You are not going to pass that inspection." I think he was doing that hoping that the guy would get mad at him and do it in spite of him. It didn't seem to me like the best strategy, but nevertheless, the guy did pass the examination. He was never quite the same after that experience, but he did pass the examination. It's just, I don't know why you would do that. I don't know why you would want to tell someone that they can't do something over and over again. It makes no sense to me. But anyway. A healthy sense of self-efficacy is essential to good coping and adjusting to new situations, figuring out what you can and can't do. Our son Josh decided he wanted to study abroad when he was in college. Between his junior and senior year, he decided to go to St. Petersburg, Russia, for study abroad. His grandmother, my wife's mother, is 100% Russian, and Josh was always fascinated with all things Russian, took Russian in college, and so he wanted to go there and see it for himself. So he was due to fly from Nashville to Geneva, and then from Geneva to St. Petersburg. Well, as luck would have it, his flight out of Nashville was 3 hours late leaving, which means he missed all of his connections, ended up on a plane to Frankfurt, Germany, where he got stuck overnight, and picked up a flight the next day to St. Petersburg. But because he was stuck overnight in Frankfurt, two things happened. One, his luggage went somewhere else, and two, the people who were supposed to meet him in St. Petersburg weren't there anymore. So when he got to St. Petersburg, he had no luggage and nobody to meet him at the airport to get him to where he was supposed to go. So several hours of anxiety later, my wife and I got a phone call from him, and what turned out was that he'd been wandering around the streets of St. Petersburg, Russia, all by himself at 11 o'clock at night, not knowing where to go or how to get anywhere. And finally he found a drugstore near a train station and talked the person who was operating the drugstore into letting him use the telephone so he could call home and give us the situation. So we knew he was safe. We didn't really know what to do with him. We said, go back to the airport and stay there, get a cab, go back to the airport and stay there until we figure this out, because we knew if he was in the airport, there would be a lot of other people around and he'd be safe. So that's what he did. And then he spent the next, and it worked out. Next day, he got hooked up with some people from the study abroad and eventually made it to where he was supposed to go. Didn't have any luggage for 4 days. He made that work too. But, you know, and all the way through it, he was like, it's okay, I'll figure it out. He believed that he could do it. And he did it. I'd have been terrified. I'd been a quivering mass on the sidewalk somewhere, just waiting for somebody to come along and scoop me up and dump me in a psych ward or something. But Josh believed he could do it, and he did it. And he's had similar experiences since then and been equally successful in figuring them out. On the whole, veterans tend to have pretty good self-efficacy with higher education. They tend to believe they can do it. And part of that is because they've been doing something before that that's, relatively speaking, a whole lot harder in many ways. You know, Josh is in law school now. He took his first exam the first year, and his mother and I are like, "Oh, Josh, how was it? How'd you do it?" Piece of cake. Did you study hard for it? No. Like, why not? Well, because, you know, if I don't pass it, nobody dies. You know, we've had to think about that a little bit. But really, when you're used to a situation where the person next to you could die at any minute, and you may have to watch that happen, or it might be you, or the person next to you on the refueling station on the ship gets washed overboard, knocked overboard. Taking an exam is no big deal, right? Doing your homework is no big deal. So relatively speaking, higher education, college, is no big deal compared to the potential of somebody or me getting killed. And so that's why veterans tend to have a pretty good self-efficacy about it.
Dr. Foote.
Yes.
Josh is not only a child of a veteran, he is a veteran. He's active.
He is on active duty, yes. Still, yes. Mm-hmm. And spent 2 years in Japan on a ship and another year there on a staff, and now he's in law school, on a Navy program. So he'll have almost 7 more years to do when he gets out of law school, at least. Optimism is another factor. How many of you are optimists? How many of you are pessimists? How many of you would like to be optimists, but you don't think it'll work? Yeah. Individual differences in optimism play a big role in adjustment to life events. The extent to which you think good things will happen to you and other people has a lot to do with your approach to whatever it is you're trying to do. By the way, you know who Oscar Wilde is? Some of you do. You may not agree with his lifestyle, but he was kind of a funny guy and said a lot of interesting things. One of them is between the optimist and the pessimist, the difference is droll. The optimist sees the donut, the pessimist the hole. An optimist is someone who just fell off the Empire State Building, and after he or she passes the 50th floor on the way down says, "So far, so good." Right? It's all in how you look at things. And the way you look at things has a lot to do with the way you behave and the way you approach things. It turns out that optimism interacts with self-efficacy quite a bit in the sense that, oops, well, that didn't work right. in the sense that higher self-efficacy leads to more optimistic expectations. Say that really fast 5 times. But if you believe you can do things, then you're more likely to expect good things to happen to you. And if you have optimistic expectations about being a student, then you're probably going to do better as a student, be more successful. Psychological health, it's getting late, isn't it? We'll do this quickly. We only got a couple more slides. Psychological health of veterans is essential to their success in higher education. We've touched on it a little bit, but imagine the difficulty of watching your friends, your buddies, your teammates, the people whose very lives depend on you, or your life depends on them. Imagine watching that person die next to you. That's no fun. And that can create an awful lot of trauma, psychological trauma. So you've had that happen to you, and a few months later you're sitting in class and some of your fellow students are making comments that indicate they don't really care about what's happening with our troops. They don't understand it. It means very little to them. How do you deal with that? How do you put those two things together? Imagine leaving a place where people just do what needs to be done. There's a job to be done, you do it. You don't complain about it, you don't question it, you just go do it. And then you find yourself in a place where people complain about, oh, we got so much homework to do. Oh, my professor is so boring. Oh, this and oh, that. But hey, did you see that hoverboard so-and-so had the other day? Isn't that cool? That's tough when you go from one to the other. It's hard to make that adjustment. And it can really mess up your mind. We did that. Sometimes you end up, there's a lot of talk about suicide in the military and suicide among veterans. You hear stories about students sitting in class who are jittery, constantly moving around because they're in a crowd, they don't know who those people are, and they've been trained to instinctively assess the crowd to make sure that there aren't any enemies there. So you end up with students who want to sit in the back so they can see everybody else. Or there's some loud noise that happens in the classroom and the person reacts to it, because loud noises mean possibility of death. Some of the effects of post-traumatic stress disorder: short attention span, lack of focus, inability to sit still, lack of patience, anger management problems, difficulty sleeping, and this learned need for constant vigilance. As a faculty member, as an instructor, you have students in your class who suffer from these things, and they're very real. My wife had a veteran. My wife teaches in the accounting department over at Jones College, by the way. She had a student in her class, in her office just last week who has anger management issues, a veteran. And called me in my office, said, hey, you need to come up here. And so I went up to her office. She wasn't afraid, but he was clearly getting very angry and having trouble controlling his actions. And so I went up and made myself present while she was dealing with him, just as an extra person, as a male figure, to kind of help calm the situation down. And this is going to happen more and more, people in classes. And it's something that as students and faculty we need to be aware of and to understand better what the effects of someone's military experience can be and how that might manifest itself in the classroom. We've touched on a few of the many factors that impact veteran success or lack thereof in making the transition from soldier to student. While the specific training that veterans received in the military isn't necessarily one of those factors, the experiences those people had certainly play a role in shaping them for successful or not transitions. Culture, self-efficacy, optimism, combined with what people take away from the military, such as identity, psychological health, perhaps post-traumatic stress disorder, not to mention physical disabilities sometimes, all work together toward either positive or negative experiences in higher education. And so the only way that we can successfully approach veterans in higher education is to do it holistically. We have to consider the whole person. We've got to consider the optimism, the self-efficacy, the experiences, the identities, the cultures. All of that comes into play. It's an enormous picture for us to take into account. But if we don't take all of those things into account, we miss important factors in how students, veterans, may or may not be successful in their college experience. This is a student success issue, but it's much more than that. This is a life success issue for veterans. And we have to take it seriously. We have to approach it holistically and understand all of the many factors that are involved in it. As I understand it, that's precisely the mission of MTSU's new Veterans and Military Family Center that's going to be opened 3 days from now. I applaud General Huber and Hillary Miller and everybody else who is involved in envisioning and establishing that center for our veterans here at MTSU. And best wishes to you all, veterans or not, in your success here at MTSU and beyond. I have a couple of minutes. I don't know if anybody has any questions or not, but yes, sir.
I thought I heard from a couple of different sources that in recent years psychologists have changed PTSD to just PTS. The suggestion being that post-traumatic stress isn't not exactly a disorder, but rather a natural consequence of exposure to combat for some people.
That may be the case. I haven't seen that, but that doesn't mean it's not out there. The research that I used to put this together today all referred to it as PTSD, but that may well be the case, and if that's a recent development, that makes sense.
Questions, comments?
Thank you. I'll give it